Hello, I've just started creating content on YouTube less than a month ago. It would mean the world to me if those of you who enjoy this video please subscribe to the channel. I plan on uploading scary stories daily. Today, I have 5 truly horrifying stories that the writers claim to be true. And now, let's begin. It started at a coffee shop. I didn't go to this one often, but it was a place close to work, so I stopped in there to grab a quick drink one afternoon after an especially long meeting. The line was short, and I wasn't in any hurry, so I ordered my usual and took a seat by the window. That's when he walked in. He wasn't anything special at first glance, just a guy in his late 20s or early 30s, unremarkable in a way that most people are. He had dark hair, a little scruffy around the edges, and his clothes were a bit too nice for a coffee shop. He stood at the counter for a moment, scanning the menu before turning toward me. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" he asked, motioning to the empty seat across from mine. I glanced around. The place wasn't crowded, but there were plenty of open seats. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe I just didn't feel like being rude. Or maybe it was the way he smiled at me. Polite, but with something behind it that I didn't quite understand. He didn't wait for an answer. He sat down before I could speak. "You're new here, right?" he asked, folding his hands on the table in front of him. I looked at him for a moment, feeling a bit uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off. "Yeah, I don't come here much." "I thought so. I'd remember someone as pretty as you." It was a standard line, the kind people use when they want to make small talk. It didn't bother me at first. I laughed even. "Thanks," I said, not sure what else to say. And that was it. The conversation seemed harmless enough. He was polite, even charming in his own way. His questions weren't invasive. He asked about my job, my hobbies, and I shared bits and pieces, not thinking much of it. He never pushed too far. I told myself I was just being paranoid when I noticed the way he looked at me as I talked. It wasn't the kind of look you get from someone who's genuinely interested in what you have to say. It was more like he was studying me, analyzing me. But I told myself it was nothing. He lingered longer than I expected, but I didn't mind. When he finally got up to leave, he smiled again, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. "It was really nice meeting you," he said, his voice low, almost to the point of intimacy. I nodded awkwardly and watched him walk out the door. I didn't think I'd see him again, but I did. It was a few days later when I bumped into him again. I was on my lunch break, walking down the street near the coffee shop, when I saw him across the street. His eyes locked onto mine almost immediately, and he gave a little wave. I waved back hesitantly, figuring he was just another person I'd met by chance. But this time, instead of the polite smile from before, he had something else in his expression, something almost hungry. He crossed the street, moving quickly toward me, and I felt an uneasy flutter in my stomach. "Hey," he said, his voice a little too eager. "I thought that was you." I forced a smile, though I was already feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Small world," I said, trying to sound casual. "You live around here?" "Yeah," he said, his eyes scanning my face. I actually live pretty close. You? I shrugged. Not too far. I just moved into the area. Oh, I see, he said, his tone a little too soft, almost conspiratorial. Well, if you ever need a guide to show you around, I'd be happy to help. I chuckled nervously. That's sweet, but I think I've got it covered. The smile that spread across his face was too wide, too knowing. Sure, I just thought, it'd be nice to have someone to hang out with. It's always better to have a friend around. I nodded, my smile faltering. There was something unsettling about the way he said friend, like it meant more than just a casual offer. I made my excuses and walked away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't anything obvious, no creepy figures lurking in the shadows, but every time I turned a corner, I felt like I wasn't alone. And every time I stopped at that coffee shop, I'd glance up, and there he was, sitting at the same table, always staring at me with that same unsettling intensity. I started avoiding the place, telling myself it was nothing. But then, one evening, as I was heading home from work, I ran into him again. This time, he was standing outside my apartment building, waiting. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and he moved toward me almost too eagerly, his steps too quick. "Hey, I've been meaning to talk to you," he said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing. "I was just thinking, we should spend more time together." I backed away instinctively, my mind racing. There was something in his voice that made me feel like I was suffocating. Something in his presence that I couldn't explain. I'm really tired," I said, taking another step back. "I think I just need some rest." He didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't need rest. You need company. I could show you around, show you what you've been missing." At that moment, the air around me felt thick, suffocating. I could feel the heat of his body just inches from mine, and I could smell his cologne, something sharp and overwhelming. His hand moved, almost too slowly, as if he were savoring the moment, and before I could think, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. It felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice shaky but firm. He stopped. The smile that had been so eager disappeared, replaced by something darker. His eyes seemed colder now, calculating. "You're not being fair," he said, his voice lowering in a way that sent a chill down my spine. "I've been kind. I've been patient." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and fled up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, locking the door behind me. But even as I sat in my living room, breathing heavily, the sense of unease never left. I realized then that I hadn't been imagining it. He wasn't just a guy who had met me by chance. He was following me, watching me. He knew things about me I hadn't shared. And I knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be the last time I saw him. I never thought meeting someone on a dating app would end like this. I guess when you're looking for companionship, you don't expect it to spiral into something as dark and twisted as this. It all started innocently enough. I was swiping through the app, half-heartedly hoping to meet someone interesting. The usual types popped up, people with blurry pictures, vague bios, or ones that looked too good to be true. But then I saw his profile. His name was Alex, simple, unassuming, nothing strange about it at first glance. His picture was a candid shot. He was smiling, sitting in a park, with a dog beside him, looking approachable. His bio was friendly, almost too friendly, but in a way that didn't feel forced. He seemed genuine. We started talking the first day, casual stuff at first, the usual small talk. What do you do for a living? How's your day going? But what set him apart from everyone else I'd talked to was how quickly he opened up. He didn't rush me, but he told me about his life, his job as an IT consultant, his love for hiking, his family. And he actually asked about my life in a way that didn't feel scripted. He was interested, and for the first time in a while, I didn't mind sharing. Our conversations went on for weeks. We texted constantly, and sometimes we'd even talk on the phone for hours. There was something comforting about it, a steady stream of communication that made me feel like I was connecting with someone real, not just some faceless person behind a screen. He seemed normal. At first, I enjoyed the attention. Who wouldn't? It felt good to feel wanted. Alex was kind, thoughtful, and funny. He'd send me little messages in the morning just to check in, wishing me a good day. And by the evening, he'd always be there to talk about whatever was on my mind. He was sweet, almost to a fault. He was never pushy, never intrusive, and for some reason, I began to trust him. But then something changed, slowly at first, and then all at once. It started with him sending me gifts, small things, nothing major, flowers delivered to my office, chocolates left at my doorstep. The first time it happened, I was flattered. It was thoughtful, and I thanked him, telling him how sweet it was. But after a few more deliveries, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't so much the gifts themselves, but the frequency. A gift every week, and sometimes more than one. He began to send me long, drawn-out texts about how much he was thinking about me, how he couldn't wait to meet me in person. It wasn't long before he started asking more personal questions about my family, my friends, even where I lived. I tried to keep things vague, but he always seemed to find a way to dig deeper. "How's your sister doing? I remember you mentioned her once," he'd say. Or, "Your friends seem really nice. When are you going to introduce me?" At first, I thought it was harmless. Maybe he was just excited. But then I realized that he was remembering everything I told him, every detail, no matter how small. Things began to feel off when he started showing up unannounced. It was subtle at first. One day, after I mentioned I was going for a run, he texted me an hour later, "I saw you on your run today. You looked great." That was the first moment I felt the shift. He had been watching me. I was caught off guard, but I played it off like it was no big deal. "Wow, that's a little creepy, don't you think?" I joked. He apologized immediately, saying he didn't mean to make me uncomfortable. But I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to be rude, but I pulled back a little. I stopped responding as quickly, and I started limiting our conversations. But he didn't take the hint. The texts came more frequently, sometimes multiple times a day. He'd ask where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation. He would check in with me constantly. How was work? What did you eat for dinner? Who are you with tonight? At first, I thought it was sweet. He was just being overly attentive. But then I realized it wasn't just attention. It was obsession. He wasn't trying to get to know me anymore. He was trying to control my life, trying to invade it. That's when the calls started. He would call me at all hours of the day. When I didn't answer, he would leave messages, long rambling ones that were almost too emotional, too desperate. He would say things like, "I just wanted to hear your voice," or, "I miss talking to you. I need to hear from you, please." I tried blocking his number a few times, but he kept coming back with new ones, always apologizing for his behavior and saying he just wanted to make sure I was okay. One night, I decided to take a step back and let him know how uncomfortable he was making me. I told him I needed some space. I needed him to back off and stop contacting me for a while. He didn't take it well. He sent me a long message, begging me not to push him away. He said he loved me. I hadn't even met him in person, but somehow, in his mind, we were already more than that. When I didn't reply to that message, he showed up at my apartment. I was sitting on my couch when I saw his face through the peephole. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I scrambled to lock the door and pull the curtains shut. I called a friend, desperate to get some help, but Alex's knocks were persistent. He kept calling out my name, soft at first, and then louder. "Please, let me in. I just want to talk. You can't do this to me." I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. The next morning, I filed a police report. I showed them the messages, the calls, and the gifts. I had to admit, I was scared, not just for myself, but for the people around me. This man was dangerously obsessed. The police took it seriously, and after some investigation, managed to track him down. The authorities found out that Alex had been following me for weeks, showing up near my workplace, my gym, even the grocery store. He'd been looking for me in person long before I had any idea. They issued a restraining order, one that was supposed to keep him away from me for good. But even after that, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still watching me. I started to double-check my locks at night, keep an eye on the street outside my apartment, and avoid going anywhere alone. Months passed. I didn't hear from him directly again, but his presence still lingered. I'd occasionally see a shadow in my peripheral vision, or hear a knock at the door when no one was there. It was a constant reminder that the person I thought I knew was never the person I met on that app. And every time I felt that chill run down my spine, I wondered how close I'd come to becoming just another story. The kind of story people hear and think, that would never happen to me. But it does. It could happen to anyone. Even now, when I think back on those months, I wonder if he ever truly let me go. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd walk away from a career I loved. But then, sometimes, things happen that shake you to your core. Things you can't explain, and things you're better off not trying to understand. I've been a nurse for over a decade. It was never just a job for me. It was a calling. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and from an early age, I was fascinated by the human body and the way it worked. My mother, a nurse herself, was the first person who sparked my interest. I remember following her around the hospital when I was little, hanging on to her every word as she explained the simplest things about care. She'd make it look so easy, like she was always in control. I admired that calm, the way she could handle any situation with a gentle smile and a firm hand. I was still in high school when I realized I wanted to follow in her footsteps. By the time I graduated, there was no question. I enrolled in nursing school, and though it was grueling, I pushed through the long hours studying, the endless tests, the clinical hours spent caring for people. All of it was worth it. I loved being able to help. I loved that moment when someone looked at me and said, "Thank you." It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. I started my career working day shifts at a local hospital, but as the years passed, I found myself gravitating toward the night shift. There was something different about it, something quieter, more intimate. The hospital had a different feel during the night. Fewer people, more space. I could hear my thoughts clearer, the hum of machines in the background, the steady beeping of monitors marking time. I liked the challenge, too. The night shift was always more intense. Fewer staff, more critical patients, more unpredictability. It kept me on my toes. But after what happened, I couldn't stay in that environment anymore. Not after what I saw that night. It was a Wednesday, about 6 months ago now. The hospital was busy, but not overwhelmed. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to be running smoothly. I was on the floor, moving from patient to patient, checking in, making sure vitals were stable, administering medications, doing the rounds. There were a few admissions, mostly routine cases, elderly patients recovering from surgery, a few people who'd gotten sick from the flu. Nothing out of the ordinary. And then he arrived. His name was Mr. Abernathy. He was in his late 50s, a tall man with graying hair and a gaunt, almost skeletal face. When they wheeled him into the ER, he was conscious but barely. He had a look of someone who had been in pain for far too long. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow, and his eyes, those eyes, had a dullness to them, like he was already a step removed from the world around him. The doctor on call ordered a CT scan to rule out any neurological issues. The scans came back clean, which meant that whatever was wrong with him wasn't easily identifiable. It was a mystery. And when there's a mystery in a hospital, especially at night, it's often the nurses who are left to deal with it. I was assigned to Mr. Abernathy's care for the night. He was a quiet patient. He never spoke more than a few words at a time. Every time I checked in on him, he'd look at me with those dull, vacant eyes, and I'd feel a pang of discomfort. It was subtle at first. Maybe it was the way he never blinked when I spoke to him, or how his gaze seemed to follow me when I wasn't looking. But that wasn't the worst part. Around 2 a.m, when the ward was still and most patients were asleep, something happened that made my stomach turn. I was sitting at the nurse's station when I heard the faintest noise, a low groaning sound like someone was in pain. I thought it might be Mr. Abernathy. I stood up and walked down the hallway, stopping briefly at the nurse's station to check on the monitors. No alarms. no warning signs. His vitals were stable. I approached his room slowly, peering through the small window in the door. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but when I opened the door, I froze. Mr. Abernathy was sitting up in his bed, but he wasn't looking at me. His head was tilted to the side, and his fingers were tapping on the edge of the bed, slowly, rhythmically, like he was in some sort of trance. His breathing was even, but something about him was off. "Mr. Abernathy," I called softly. His head snapped toward me so quickly that I took a step back. His eyes were wide, unblinking, but there was something in them, something strange, something I couldn't quite place. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was almost knowing, like he was aware of something I wasn't. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. That was strange enough in itself. He had barely spoken all evening, yet now his voice was strong and lucid. But what really unsettled me was what he said next. "You don't need to worry about me," he whispered. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." The room felt colder suddenly, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. My instincts told me to leave, but I stayed. There was something magnetic about him, something drawing me in despite the creeping unease in my chest. I asked if he needed anything, but he just smiled again. "I'm fine. Go on, nurse. Your shift is almost over." I stepped back toward the door, but something caught my eye. His hand, the one that had been tapping the side of the bed, was now resting on his chest, and it was twitching, almost like it was moving of its own accord. For a moment, it seemed like his fingers were twitching in time to some unheard rhythm. Before I could process it, I turned and left the room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I didn't get much sleep. Mr. Abernathy's words haunted me. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." By morning, his condition had taken a strange turn. He was still alive, but he was no longer responsive. His eyes were open, but there was no sign of awareness. He didn't respond to any stimulus. I tried to talk to him, but he just stared at the ceiling, unblinking. It wasn't long before they called in a specialist. It was only after several hours of tests that they confirmed something none of us had anticipated. Mr. Abernathy was in a vegetative state. No brain activity, no response to stimuli. The doctors were baffled. There had been no warning signs, no medical explanation for what had happened. I couldn't get his words out of my head. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." In the following days, as I went through the motions of my shift, the hospital became a different place for me. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights seemed to carry a deeper meaning. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, something just beyond my understanding. But the worst part came a week later when I returned to work for another night shift. I was doing my rounds when I came across something that made my blood run cold. A small folded piece of paper in Mr. Abernathy's room. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. It was a drawing, a crude sketch of a nurse wearing scrubs, her face distorted in terror, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a scream, and beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, was one simple sentence: "You're next." I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't shake it. That night, I put in my resignation. The decision wasn't made lightly, but I couldn't go back. Something had snapped in me. The hospital, once my sanctuary, had become my prison. I left nursing behind that night, finding work elsewhere. But no matter what I did, I couldn't forget Mr. Abernathy or the strange, haunting things I had experienced that night. And I still wonder, who was he really? And what had he meant by his cryptic message? Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear his voice echoing in the dark. "You're next." I've always been a watcher, the kind of person who observes from the edges of a room rather than taking center stage. It's not that I'm shy, but I've found life to be more revealing when you sit back and listen instead of constantly trying to be heard. That's how I ended up knowing so much about the people in my town, how I caught on to things others ignored, and, ultimately, how I figured out that someone close to me was a killer. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, nestled between endless forests and mountains that always seemed to loom a little too close. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. It was a quiet place, sleepy even, until the murders started. The first body was found near the lake, just outside of town. A hiker, a woman in her early 30s, discovered with her throat cut. The sheriff, a steady man named Donnelly, had initially chalked it up to a drifter passing through. That theory held until the second body turned up a month later, a teenage boy, barely 17, left in nearly the same condition. Then came the third and the fourth. Panic gripped the town in slow waves. People were cautious, but still hopeful that it was just some horrible coincidence. When the fifth victim was found, that's when the fear truly settled in. My mother started locking the doors religiously. My father bought a gun. Schools sent out warnings. Curfews were quietly suggested, but there were no suspects, no real leads, just the bodies and a creeping sense of dread. Through all of this, I watched. I paid attention to the details others overlooked, and something gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake. The murders weren't random. The victims weren't connected in any obvious way, but I started noticing a pattern in their routines. A grocery store clerk, a local mechanic, a high school student, a librarian, a waitress. Different ages, different genders, but all of them had one thing in common. They had all, at some point, interacted with my best friend, Nate. The grocery store clerk, Jenna, used to work the late shift. Nate always stopped by after work to grab snacks, chatting with her like they were old friends. The mechanic, Tom, had worked on Nate's car multiple times, even letting him hang around the shop after hours. The high school student, Lucas, was a sophomore who used to ride bikes with us when we were younger. Nate always treated him like a little brother. The librarian, Mrs. Henshaw, had once helped Nate research something for a college paper, and I remembered her mentioning how eager he had been about some obscure crime statistics. And the waitress, Cara, had once gone on a couple of dates with Nate before telling me he creeped her out. She said there was something off about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Nate and I had been friends since childhood. He was charismatic, effortlessly charming in a way that made people like him without trying. He had that kind of face, clean-cut, warm-eyed, the last person you'd ever suspect of anything sinister. Maybe that's why it took me so long to see it. I started going through my old messages with him, looking for something, anything, that might explain the growing pit in my stomach. That's when I found the first real crack in his mask. A text from months ago, the day after the first murder. "Lake's a weird place at night, man. Gives me the creeps." At the time, it had meant nothing, but now I reread it with fresh eyes. He had brought up the lake before the body was found. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just coincidence. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The final proof came the night I followed him. It was reckless, but I had to know for sure. He left his house just before midnight, heading toward the outskirts of town. I stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen, heart hammering in my chest. He walked with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. And then he stopped, right near the woods where the last body had been found. I watched as he crouched down, moving something in the dirt. My stomach twisted when I saw what it was. A knife, half buried, stained dark even under the weak moonlight. I must have made a sound, because he turned so fast it was like he sensed me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice almost gentle. That was when I ran. I don't know how I made it back home without him catching me. I don't know why he didn't chase me. Maybe he wanted to see what I would do. Maybe he thought I wouldn't tell. But the moment I burst through my front door, I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff. They found the knife. They found more than that. Buried trophies, keepsakes from the victims. Evidence so damning it sealed his fate instantly. When they arrested him, he didn't fight. He just looked at me through the patrol car window, the same smile on his face. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't figured it out, if I had ignored the signs like everyone else. But I know one thing for certain. I don't watch from the sidelines anymore. I had always prided myself on being independent. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, just enough space for me to stretch out, keep my things organized, and enjoy my solitude. It wasn't a big house, but it was mine, and that was enough. I had a decent job working in an office, nothing too exciting, but it paid the bills and kept my days busy. I didn't mind the quiet of the evenings either. It was peaceful, and I had my routines, my evening walks, a book by the window, dinner in front of the TV. Life had always been simple and predictable, and I liked it that way. But that all changed one rainy afternoon in early spring, when my water heater started acting up. It was a minor issue at first, a little puddle near the bathroom sink, a slight drip coming from the pipes beneath the sink. But it wasn't long before I realized it was more than just a leak. My water pressure was fluctuating, the shower didn't get hot anymore, and the pipes groaned as if they were protesting every turn of the faucet. I tried fixing it myself, poking around in the basement with tools I barely knew how to use, but nothing worked. It was obvious I needed professional help. So, I called a handyman. His name was Ray, or at least that's what he told me when he arrived the next day. He seemed harmless enough, in his mid-30s, a little rough around the edges, but polite. I had met handymen before, but there was something about Ray that set him apart. Maybe it was his easy smile, or the way he looked me directly in the eye when he spoke. It was disarming, almost too friendly, but I didn't think much of it at first. I was just relieved to have someone who knew what they were doing. Ray spent the next few hours fixing the plumbing issues, explaining every step to me as he worked. I didn't know much about plumbing, so I just nodded along, pretending to understand. He seemed like a professional. His hands were steady, his movements efficient. He didn't seem like the type to make small talk, but he asked about my job, my hobbies, just the basics. I didn't mind. I was used to people making small talk. He left the job done and my house in order. When he finished, he gave me a polite smile and said, "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to call." I thanked him and paid him for his time, thinking that would be the last I'd see of him. But I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I began to run into Ray in odd places. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but the more it happened, the more uneasy I became. The first time it happened was at the grocery store. I had just picked up a few items and was heading to the self-checkout when I heard a familiar voice. "Hey there, how's everything going?" I looked up, startled, to see Ray standing just a few feet away, a cart full of groceries in his hands. I didn't remember seeing him there when I entered the store. I smiled awkwardly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. "Oh, hey Ray, fancy running into you here." He grinned like it was no big deal. "I shop here all the time. What about you?" I tried to keep the conversation casual, but something about the way he was staring at me, almost too intensely, made my stomach churn. "Yeah, I come here every couple of weeks." "Well, it's good to see you," he said, his smile lingering a little too long before he pushed his cart down the aisle. I didn't think much more about it that day, but over the next few weeks, it started to happen more often. I would see him at the post office, walking down the street, or even at the local coffee shop. Each time, it felt more like an encounter than a coincidence. I began to feel watched, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It was as if he had some sixth sense that told him where I would be at any given time. It wasn't as if he was lurking in the shadows, but every time I turned a corner, he was there, always smiling, always acting like he had just happened to be in the same place at the same time. But the real turning point came one evening when I went to take a shower. I had just gotten home from work and was exhausted, so I decided to unwind with a long, hot shower. When I stepped into the bathroom and drew back the curtain, I froze. There, nestled in the corner of the shower, was something small and black. At first, I thought it was a hair tie or some forgotten object, but as I reached for it, I realized it was a tiny camera, hidden so well it almost blended into the grout. My breath caught in my throat. I knew immediately what it was. A hidden camera. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced. How long had it been there? Had I unknowingly been watched every time I took a shower? I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the panic was rising, choking me. My thoughts spiraled. Ray had been here recently. He had worked on the plumbing. Had he put this in there? Had he been watching me all along? I pulled the camera out of the shower and examined it. It was small, but well constructed. There was no obvious way to trace it back to him, but I didn't need that. I knew who had done this. I immediately called the police. The officer who responded to my call was kind, but firm. He assured me that they would investigate and take my concerns seriously. They didn't take the camera for testing right away, but they did start looking into Ray. The investigation revealed that Ray wasn't just a random handyman. He had a history. The police discovered that Ray had been secretly recording women in their homes for years. When they checked his past, they found multiple incidents where women reported strange encounters, odd coincidences, and things being out of place after he'd visited their homes for repairs. The hidden camera in my shower was just the tip of the iceberg. When they raided his apartment, they found several more cameras, all hidden in different locations in his previous clients' homes. There were recordings of women in bathrooms, bedrooms, and living rooms, moments they'd never known were being watched. He had been tracking their routines, learning their schedules, and using that information to appear in their lives as if by chance. Ray was arrested that night. The police found enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of voyeurism, invasion of privacy, and stalking. His arrest was widely covered in the news, and more women came forward, sharing similar stories of encounters that now seemed sinister in hindsight. I filed a formal statement, and Ray was placed in custody. He was facing serious charges, not just for what he had done to me, but for years of similar offenses to other women. The police were able to connect his behavior to a long pattern of manipulation and exploitation, and there was no question that he would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. In the months that followed, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had narrowly avoided becoming just another victim in a string of incidents. As much as the legal process gave me some sense of closure, it also left me shaken. Ray wasn't just someone who fixed my plumbing. He had meticulously infiltrated the lives of multiple women, and I had been one of them. Even with his arrest, I couldn't shake the fear that lingered. I found myself constantly double-checking locks, always looking over my shoulder, and occasionally hearing things in the night that made my heart race. It wasn't just about the violation of privacy. It was the fear that someone like him could blend so easily into the background of everyday life. Eventually, I moved too. I needed a fresh start, but the memories of those unsettling encounters and the knowledge that Ray had been watching me for so long never fully faded. Even now, sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I wonder if he's still out there, and if I'm still somehow a part of his twisted collection. I hope not, but I'll never be completely sure.